Azubuike, you are a wealthy man, yet your children, they look like children of hunger. Why?
My family is not your concern.
But they are suffering, Azubi. We see them every day.
Suffering! No one fed me when I was young. My father left me to struggle. I built myself. That is why I'm rich. My children will train themselves too.
But Azubuike, they are still children.
Good. Let them learn early.
And Adobe, your wife?
She's not my responsibility. A house can be full of food and still be starving.
The sun hung high in the sky that afternoon, casting long shadows across the dusty path as Azubike returned from his farm, his shoulders broad, his walking stick swinging confidently in his hand. The smell of fresh earth still clung to his clothes, and the sweat on his forehead glistened under the harsh light. Everyone in the village knew Azubike as a wealthy farmer, a man whose barns were full and whose lands stretched farther than most men could walk in a day. But on that day, before he could reach his compound, 3 elders stepped quietly into his path and stopped him. Among them were Nana, Okeke, and Maduka. Their faces were calm, but their eyes carried the heavy weight of something that had troubled their hearts for a long time. Nana, the oldest among them, leaned gently on his staff and looked at Azubike with deep, searching eyes. Azubike, he said slowly, his voice firm but not unkind, you are a wealthy man. Everyone knows this. Yet your children, they look like children of hunger. Why? For a moment the wind seemed to pause between them. Azubike frowned immediately, his expression tightening as if the question itself was an insult. He adjusted the cloth on his shoulder and replied sharply, my family is not your concern. The elders exchanged brief glances, but Maduka stepped forward again, unwilling to let the matter rest so easily. His voice carried quiet concern. But they are suffering, Azubike. We see them every day. Azubike suddenly laughed, but it was not the laugh of a happy man. It was bitter, sharp, and filled with old anger. Suffering, he scoffed. No one fed me when I was young. The men fell silent, listening. Azubike continued, his voice rising with a strange pride that hid years of buried pain. My father gave birth to me and left me alone to struggle. I suffered. I worked. I fought for every grain of food I ate. I built myself with my own hands. That is why I am rich today. As he spoke, he pointed carelessly toward his compound in the distance where thin children often sat quietly outside their one house. My children will train themselves too, he declared. Okeke shook his head slowly, disbelief in his tired eyes. But Azubike, they are still children. Azubike only shrugged, his face hard like dry wood. Good, he said coldly. Let them learn early. A heavy silence fell among the elders. Nana's voice returned, softer now, but filled with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. And Adebi, your wife? Azubike did not hesitate even for a second. His answer came out like a stone thrown into water. She is not my responsibility. The elders were stunned into silence. Even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to stop their singing. Slowly, Azubike brushed past them and continued walking toward his compound as if nothing important had just been said. The elders stood there watching his back grow smaller along the dusty road. Finally, Maduka sighed deeply and shook his head. Nana looked toward Azubike's house in the distance, his voice low and heavy with meaning. A house can be full of food, he murmured slowly, and still be starving. If this story has already touched your heart, take a moment now to support this channel by subscribing. And when you have done that, sit back, relax, and listen carefully, as I take you through this powerful story passed down by the elders. The story truly begins with a man called Azubike, a name that meant the past is strength. And indeed, the past had made him strong. But it had also made him hard in ways that no one could easily understand. Azubike was known across the village as a wealthy farmer, a man whose name carried weight whenever it was mentioned among elders. His young barns stood tall and wide like silent monuments of success, filled from the floor to the roof with large healthy tubers. When the harvest season came, men would gather near his barns and whisper among themselves, "If Asubike is not the richest man in this village, then he must be among the richest." His farm stretched so far that a man could walk for a long time before reaching their end. Palm trees stood proudly along the edges of his land like loyal guards watching over his wealth. His goats were many, wandering confidently through the compound, while chickens crashed noisily at the dusty ground, clucking as if they too knew they belonged to a powerful household. Everything around Asubike spoke of abundance. Everything except his home. Because there was something strange that no one could ignore for long. A man with such wealth lived in a compound that looked poor. His house looked worn. His wife looked poorer. And his children looked poorest of all. Asubike had married a gentle young woman named Adeobi. Adeobi came from a respectable family where she had been raised with good values. She was respectful, hardworking, and patient, the kind of woman elders described as a blessing to any home. When the marriage was announced years earlier, many people had nodded in approval. Adeobi is lucky, women said. She will live in comfort. But comfort never came. From the very first year of their marriage, Asubike began treating Adeobi with a cold distance that slowly drained the joy from her life. He did not beat her. No. What he did was worse. He neglected her as if she were invisible. Adeobi was not allowed to farm on his land. She was not allowed to trade in the market. She was not allowed to earn even the smallest coin for herself. Whenever she tried to speak about helping the family, Asubike would dismiss her with a wave of his hand. "Stay in the house," he would say flatly. "A woman who walks outside forgets her place." And so Adeobi stayed. But every morning brought a ritual that slowly broke her heart. Before leaving the house, Asubike would walk humbly to his large yam barn. The wooden door would creak open as he stepped inside. For a moment he would stand there, staring at the mountain of yam stacked inside the barn, enough to feed many families for months. Then he would bend down and pick just one yam. Only one. He would walk back to the house and drop it in front of Adeobi as if it were nothing. "Cook this for the children," he would say without emotion. Adeobi would stare silently at the single yam lying on the ground. Then her eyes would slowly turn toward the children standing nearby. Four small faces looking at her with quiet hunger. Chibuzo, the eldest, tried to act strong but his thin arms betrayed him. Obina stood beside him, his eyes always searching the cooking pot even before the fire was lit. Little Amarachi often rubbed her stomach softly, while the youngest, Samtechuku, sometimes asked the question that broke Adeobi's heart the most. "Mama, will there be enough today?" Adeobi would force a smile she did not feel. "Yes, my child," she would whisper gently. But she knew the truth. The yam would never be enough. Never. She would peel it carefully, slice it thin, and cook watery yam porridge that looked more like soup than food. When it was ready, she divided the small portions carefully into 4 bowls. The children would sit quietly as they ate slowly, stretching every bite, hoping somehow their stomachs would believe they had eaten enough. But hunger always returned. Their clothes were torn and faded. Their small bodies looked thin and weak. And their eyes carried a quiet sadness no child should ever carry. Yet Adeobi herself looked worse than them all. Her once bright wrapper had faded from too many washings. Her cheeks had grown hollow with hunger. Her shoulders bent slightly under the weight of silent suffering she never spoke about. Still she endured everything quietly for the sake of her children. But in a village where eyes are always watching, such things never remain hidden forever. Slowly, people began to notice. And they began to whisper. One hot afternoon, as Asubike returned from his farm with dust on his feet and his hoe resting across his shoulder, 3 elders stepped quietly into his path and stopped him. Among them were Nana, Okeke, and Maduka, men whose voices carried weight in the village. Nana leaned gently on his staff and studied Asubike's face for a moment before speaking. His voice was calm but heavy with concern. "Asubike, you are a wealthy man. Everyone knows this. Your barns are full, your farms are large. Yet your children, he paused and shook his head slowly, your children look like children of hunger. Why? Azubike's face tightened immediately. He frowned as if the question itself offended him. My family is not your concern, he replied sharply. The elders exchanged brief glances, but Maduka stepped forward again, refusing to let the matter rest. But they are suffering, he said gently. We see them every day. Azubike suddenly laughed, but there was no joy in it, only bitterness that had clearly lived inside him for many years. Suffering, he scoffed. No one fed me when I was young. The elders remained silent, allowing him to speak. Azubike's voice grew stronger as old memories pushed their way out. My father gave birth to me and left me alone to struggle. I suffered. I worked day and night. I built myself with my own hands. That is why I am rich today. As he spoke, he lifted his hand and pointed carelessly toward his house in the distance. My children will train themselves too. Okeke shook his head slowly, his brows knitted in disbelief. But Azubike, they are still children. Azubike simply shrugged his shoulders as if the matter meant nothing. Good, he said coldly. Let them learn early. A quiet sadness settled over the elders. Nana sighed deeply before asking one final question. And Adebi, your wife? Azubike did not hesitate. His answer came out hard and without emotion. She is not my responsibility. The elders were stunned into silence. For a moment no one spoke. They simply stood there watching as Azubike brushed past them and continued walking toward his compound without looking back. When he had gone far enough, Maduka slowly shook his head. Nana gazed toward Azubike's house in the distance and murmured softly, his voice heavy with meaning, a house can be full of food and still be starving. Years passed slowly in Azubike's compound, each day blending into the next like a long season of quiet suffering. Through it all, Adebi endured everything in silence. She never insulted her husband. She never shouted. She never fought. Instead, she gathered all the strength left in her fragile body and poured it into protecting her children. Whenever the food was too small, she made sure the children ate first. If the portions were not enough, she quietly pushed her own share toward them with a gentle smile. Many nights she went to bed with nothing in her stomach, but she never complained. At night, when darkness covered the compound and the children lay close to her on their thin mats, Adebi would gather them into her arms and tell them stories. Stories of kindness. Stories of brave people who overcame hardship. Stories of hope and a future brighter than the life they were living. One day, she would whisper softly, stroking Amarachi's hair, your lives will be better than this. The children listened with wide eyes, clinging to her words like fragile promises. But hunger does not disappear because of stories. Sometimes little Samtechuku would turn restlessly on the mat and whisper in a weak voice, Mother, my stomach hurts. Adebi's heart would tighten painfully inside her chest. She would pull the boy into her arms and hold him close. Sleep, my child, she would whisper gently. Tomorrow will be better. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Tomorrow was always the same. One yam. For hungry children. And a silent mother trying to make the impossible work. Then, after the birth of the fourth child, something happened that would change everything. One quiet evening, Azubike called Adebi to stand before him. His face was serious, his tone firm as always. I want more children, he said simply. Adebi stared at him in shock. For a moment she wondered if she had heard him wrongly. More children. Children who would grow up in the same hunger and suffering as the others. The thought alone made her chest tighten. For the first time since their marriage, something inside Adebi refused to stay silent. Her voice trembled, but she forced the word out. No, the single word hung in the air like a sudden clap of thunder. Asubike's eyes narrowed as he stared at her. What did you say? Adeabi swallowed hard, her hands shaking slightly, but she did not lower her gaze. I will not bring another child into this suffering, she said quietly. The compound became painfully silent. Even the evening breeze seemed to stop moving. Asubike's face darkened slowly. So you refuse your husband? He asked, his voice cold. Adeabi stood her ground, though fear was rising inside her chest. I refuse to bring another child into hunger, she replied. For a long moment Asubike said nothing. Then he turned and walked away without another word. But as he disappeared into the darkness of the compound, something dangerous had already begun forming in his mind. Not long after that tense evening, Asubike made an announcement that spread through the village like wildfire. He would take another wife. People whispered the news from one compound to another, their voices filled with curiosity and quiet speculation. Another wife, some asked in surprise. What kind of woman would agree to marry Asubike? Soon the answer arrived. Her name was Chinelo. The day Chinelo came to the compound was bright and warm, the sun shining strongly over the roofs and trees. Villagers pretended to pass by on their usual errands, but many slowed their steps just to catch a glimpse of the new woman entering Asubike's household. Chinelo walked through the compound gate with calm confidence. She was tall, her posture straight, her step steady and unafraid. Strength showed in the way she carried herself, the kind of strength that did not need loud words to be noticed. Her eyes were sharp and observant, yet there was a quiet kindness resting behind them. As custom demanded, she greeted the elders and neighbors respectfully. Good afternoon, she said politely, bowing her head slightly. Her voice was calm, neither timid nor arrogant. But anyone watching closely could see one clear truth: Chinelo was not the type of woman people could easily intimidate. The moment she stepped into the compound, her eyes began taking in everything around her. And the first person she truly noticed was Adeabi. The woman stood quietly near the doorway of the house, her faded wrapper hanging loosely around her thin frame. Her face looked worn from years of silent endurance. Around her stood the children, small bodies and hungry eyes watching everything carefully. Chinelo paused. Her gaze moved from Adeabi's hollow cheeks to the children's thin arms. Something tightened painfully inside her chest. Later that evening, when the compound had grown quieter and the sun was sinking low in the sky, Chinelo finally turned to Asubike and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she arrived. Why do your wife and children look like this? Her voice was calm but direct. Asubike barely looked at her. He simply waved his hand dismissively as if brushing away a fly. Mind your business, he said flatly. Chinelo held his gaze for a moment but said nothing more. Instead, she nodded slowly and turned away. But from that moment on, Chinelo began watching everything in the compound carefully. She watched the children. She watched Adeabi. She watched Asubike. And the more she observed what was happening inside that house, the more her blood began to boil. The next morning began like every other morning in Asubike's compound. The sun had barely risen when Asubike walked toward his young barn with slow, confident steps. Adeabi stood quietly outside the house while the children lingered nearby, their eyes already searching for the small food that would decide their day. The large wooden door of the barn creaked open as Asubike stepped inside. For a moment he stood there, staring at the mountain of yams stacked high inside the barn. Then, just as he had done for years, he bent down and picked up one single yam. Only one. He came out of the barn and dropped it carelessly on the ground in front of Adeabi. Cook, he said flatly, already turning to leave. But before he could take another step, something unexpected happened. Chinelo stepped forward. She looked down at the single yam lying on the ground. Slowly, her eyes moved toward the 4 children standing there, their thin faces watching the yam with quiet hunger. Then she lifted her gaze toward the massive barn behind Asubike, filled with food that could feed many families. For a moment she said nothing. Then suddenly, she laughed. The sound was sharp and surprising in the quiet compound. Azubike stopped and frowned deeply. "What is funny?" he demanded. Chinelo did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked straight up to him and pushed him aside. Azubike staggered a step backward in complete surprise, his eyes widening as he tried to understand what had just happened. Before he could react, Chinelo walked boldly into the yam barn. Moments later she came out carrying 5 large yams in her arms. She did not stop there. She walked straight to the storehouse, opened it, and began taking things out without hesitation: dried fish, palm oil, crayfish, and vegetables. Azubike stared at her as if he were looking at a spirit he could not understand. "Woman, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Chinelo did not even look at him. Instead, she lifted her voice and called loudly toward the house. "Adeabi, come to the kitchen." Adeabi stood frozen for a moment, unsure if she had heard correctly. The children, however, did not hesitate. Their eyes lit up with excitement as they hurried after Chinelo. Soon the kitchen fire was burning brightly. Pots clanged. Water boiled. The rich smell of food slowly began filling the compound. Thick, delicious yam porridge bubbled inside the pot, filled with fish, vegetables, and spices. The children sat nearby, watching with wide eyes and impatient smiles. When the food was finally served, they began to eat. And eat. And eat. For the first time in years, their stomachs were truly full. Laughter escaped from their mouths between bites of food. Even Adeabi could hardly believe what was happening. Meanwhile, outside the kitchen, Azubike stood staring at everything like a man who had forgotten how to move. He remained there, silent and confused, like a statue that had suddenly come to life but did not know what to do next. Days passed, and the strange new routine in Azubike's compound continued. Every morning, Azubike still walked to his barn the same way he had done for years. He would open the door, look at the mountain of yams, and come out carrying one single tuber. He would drop it before Adeabi and say the same code word he always said. "Cook." But now, there was Chinelo. And Chinelo had no intention of letting things remain the same. The moment Azubike turned his back, she would step forward, push past him without hesitation, and walk straight into the barn. Soon she would come out carrying 4 or 5 more yams in her arms. If there was fish in the storehouse, she took it. If there were vegetables, she added them. Before long the kitchen fire would be burning again, and the rich smell of real food would spread across the compound. The children no longer watched the cooking pot with silent desperation. Now they laughed, talked, and waited eagerly for the meal. Whenever Azubike complained, Chinelo simply ignored him as if his words were nothing more than the buzzing of a stubborn fly. At first Azubike tried to shout, "Woman, stop touching what is mine." But Chinelo would continue walking as if she had not heard him at all. This went on day after day, until the anger that had been building inside Azubike finally exploded. One afternoon, his patience snapped. He stormed across the compound toward Chinelo, his face dark with rage. Adeabi and the children froze where they stood as his loud voice filled the air. "How dare you challenge me in my own house?" he shouted. In a flash of anger, Azubike raised his hand, ready to strike her across the face. But before the slap could land, Chinelo moved. Her hand shot up quickly and grabbed his wrist in midair. Family. Very family. The sudden force stopped him completely. Azubike froze in place, his arm trapped in her grip. For a moment neither of them moved. Chinelo slowly lifted her eyes and looked directly into his. Her voice was calm, steady, and dangerously quiet. "Do not try that again." The strength in her grip shocked him. This was not the trembling resistance he had expected. This was solid, unshaken defiance. Azubike slowly pulled his hand back, his pride wounded and his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. For the first time in his life, a strange realization settled heavily inside him. This woman standing before him was not afraid of him. In a village where stories moved faster than the wind, it did not take long before the news spread everywhere. What had begun as quiet whispers soon became loud conversations in every corner of the village. People spoke about it at the stream, in the market, and under the large trees where men gathered in the evenings to talk. The story was simple but shocking. The wealthy farmer Asubike, the man whose barns were always full, now had a second wife who pushed him aside and helped herself to his young barn as if it belonged to her. By nightfall the men at the evening gathering could not stop laughing about it. One man slapped his thigh and burst into laughter. "Have you heard? Asubike has finally met his owner." The group roared with amusement. Another man shook his head, grinning widely. "That is what happens when a lion marries a lioness." Someone else added jokingly, "Oh. So it is a woman that now guards Asubike's young barn." The laughter grew louder, echoing into the night air. Some men even began imitating how Chinelo boldly walked into the barn while Asubike stood outside looking helpless. Meanwhile, whenever these stories reached Asubike's ears, his face would tighten with anger and embarrassment. The mockery stung his pride deeply. He hated the way people laughed when they spoke about him. But there was something he hated even more. Fighting Chinelo. Because every single time he tried to stop her, every time he shouted, complained, or tried to stand in her way, Chinelo simply ignored him and did exactly what she wanted anyway. Gradually, something strange began to happen in Asubike's compound. The change did not come suddenly like a storm. It crept in slowly, like the first quiet light of dawn. One morning, instead of bringing out only one yam from the barn, Asubike came out carrying two. Another morning, he carried three. Soon it became normal for him to bring out enough food without Chinelo having to force her way into the barn. But the truth was clear to everyone. Asubike had not suddenly become kind. He simply knew that if he did not bring the food himself, Chinelo would walk in and take it anyway. And so, to avoid the daily struggle, he began bringing more on his own. Slowly, the changes began to show. The children who once sat quietly with hollow eyes began to look healthier. Their thin arms grew stronger. Their laughter returned to the compound like birds coming back after a long dry season. Sometimes their voices filled the yard as they played, their small feet running across the ground with energy they had not known before. Adeabi too began to change. The tired woman who once moved slowly like someone carrying an invisible burden now stood a little straighter. Her cheeks slowly regained their fullness. And sometimes, when the children laughed loudly, a gentle smile would appear on her face, the kind of smile she had not worn for many years. One evening, as the children chased each other across the compound, Chinelo laughed and said playfully, "Look at them now. These children have remembered they are children." Adeabi nodded softly, her voice warm with gratitude. "Yes, they are finally living." The compound that once felt like a place of quiet suffering slowly began to feel like a real home. But inside Asubike's heart, something deeper was happening. Something painful. As he watched the children eating and laughing, memories he had buried long ago began to wake up. Memories of his own childhood. Memories of a cruel father whose heart had been harder than stone. Memories of a hungry mother trying to hide her tears while her children cried for food. He remembered the long nights when his stomach burned with hunger. The anger he had carried. The promise he had made to himself that he would grow strong and never suffer like that again. But now, as he stood quietly watching his own children, a heavy realization settled over him. In trying to escape the pain of his past, he had unknowingly passed that same pain down to them. One quiet evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees and the compound rested in the soft glow of fading light, Asubike called everyone together. His voice was not loud, but it carried a seriousness that made Adeabi step out of the house immediately. She stood quietly before him, her hands folded gently in front of her. The children gathered behind her, peeking curiously around her wrapper, unsure of what was about to happen. Chinelo stood a short distance away, her arms folded across her chest as she watched carefully, her sharp eyes studying Asubike's face. For a moment no one spoke. The evening air felt heavy with anticipation. Asubike took a deep breath, as if the words he was about to speak had been trapped inside him for many years. Then finally he said quietly, "I was wrong." The compound fell completely silent. Even the children stopped moving. Slowly, Asubike turned his eyes toward Adeobi. His voice softened with regret. "Adeobi, I treated you badly." Then he looked at the children standing behind her, their small faces watching him with confusion. His throat tightened before he continued. "And you, my children. I starved you." His voice trembled now, the weight of truth pressing heavily on his heart. "My father did the same to us when I was young," he confessed slowly. "He left us to suffer. I thought that suffering made me strong, so I believed my children must suffer too." Adeobi's eyes filled with tears as she listened. The pain of the past years rose inside her chest, but so did the relief of finally hearing the truth. Asubike lowered his head slowly. His voice became quiet and humble. "But I was wrong." He paused, then spoke the words that had never crossed his lips before. "Forgive me." For a moment no one moved. Then suddenly the children ran forward and wrapped their small arms around him. Asubike stood frozen as their thin bodies pressed against him, holding him tightly. Adeobi could no longer hold back her tears. She covered her face with her hands and cried softly, years of silent pain pouring out of her heart. Nearby, Chinelo watched the moment quietly. A small, satisfied smile appeared on her face as she nodded gently to herself. At last, the man who once ruled his house with a hardened heart had finally learned how to be human. After that evening of truth and tears, something truly began to change inside Asubike. The change was not loud, and it was not forced. It came quietly, but it was real. The man who once guarded his food like a jealous spirit slowly began to open his hands. One morning, he called Adeobi and placed money into her palm. She looked down at it in surprise, unsure if she was seeing correctly. Asubike cleared his throat and spoke in a calm voice that still carried a hint of awkwardness. "Go to the market," he said. "Buy clothes, for yourself and for the children." Adeobi's eyes widened slightly. For a moment she could not speak. Then she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered softly. That day she walked to the market with a feeling she had not known in many years, excitement. The traders greeted her warmly as she carefully chose bright wrappers and strong clothes for the children. When she returned to the compound and the children saw the bundles in her hands, their eyes lit up like lamps in the night. "Mother, are those for us?" Obina asked eagerly. Adeobi smiled as she unfolded the clothes. "Yes, my children. Try them." Soon the compound filled with joyful voices as the children ran around proudly in their new outfits, laughing and showing each other their clothes. "Look at mine," Amarachi shouted happily as she spun around. Even little Santichuku jumped up and down with excitement. "Mother, see. It fits me." Adeobi stood watching them, her heart warm with a happiness she had long forgotten. Food was no longer scarce in the house. The cooking pots were often full, and the smell of rich meals filled the compound every day. The children's laughter became a constant sound in the yard as they played freely without the heavy shadow of hunger hanging over them. And as Asubike sat outside his house in the evenings, watching his family moving around the compound, he felt something new settle quietly inside his chest. Something he had never truly experienced before. Peace. As the years moved forward and peace settled firmly in Asubike's compound, Chinelo also began to build her own family. Soon she gave birth to children of her own, and the compound that once echoed with quiet suffering now rang with the lively voices of many children running, laughing, and playing together. But instead of jealousy growing between the two women, something far more beautiful took root. Adeobi and Chinelo became like true sisters. They woke up together in the mornings, tying their wrappers as they prepared the day's meals. In the kitchen they cooked side by side, their laughter sometimes rising above the sound of the crackling fire. "Chinelo, taste this soup," Adeobi would say with a playful smile. Chinelo would dip a spoon into the pot and nod approvingly. Adeobi, if you open a food stall in the market, you will become richer than Asubike. Both women would burst into laughter as the children gathered around them waiting impatiently for food. They raised their children together like one large family. When one child cried, both mothers answered. When one child misbehaved, both mothers corrected them. The once silent compound had now become a place filled with warmth, noise, and life. And Asubike himself learned very quickly that old habits could no longer rule his house. Every now and then, when a stubborn mood tried to return to him, Chinelo did not argue or shout. She simply turned and gave him one quiet glance. That single look was always enough. Asubike would immediately clear his throat, adjust his wrapper, and behave himself. Even the villagers noticed the change and could not resist teasing him during evening gatherings. One man laughed loudly and said, "Oh, our brother Asubike now lives under very good management." Another added jokingly, "That house has 2 queens and 1 obedient king." The men burst into laughter, and even Asubike could not help smiling at the truth hidden inside their jokes. Years passed, and the compound that once carried the silence of suffering now overflowed with life. Many evenings, Asubike would sit on a wooden stool outside his house, quietly watching the children run across the yard with loud laughter and endless energy. Their feet kicked up dust as they chased one another, their voices bright and carefree. Sometimes little Samtechuku would shout, "Catch me if you can," while the others ran after him in playful chaos. Asubike would simply sit there, his eyes following them with a calm smile resting on his face. His barns were still full, stacked high with healthy yams just as they had always been. His farms were still large, stretching wide under the sun. The goats still wandered through the compound, and the chickens still scratched noisily at the ground. To anyone passing by, Asubike was still the same wealthy farmer he had always been. But deep inside, he knew something had changed. His greatest wealth was no longer his barns of yams. It was the family laughing before him. One quiet evening, as the sun painted the sky with soft golden light, Asubike looked toward the 2 women sitting nearby, Adeobi and Chinelo. They were talking together while sorting vegetables for the next meal, their voices calm and familiar like sisters who had shared many years together. Asubike cleared his throat gently. Both women looked up at him. For a moment he said nothing, as if searching for the right words. Then he spoke quietly. "You both saved my life." Chinelo looked at him and burst into a short laugh, shaking her head. "No," she replied playfully. "We saved your house." Adeobi smiled softly beside her and added in a gentle voice, "A house full of love never goes hungry." Asubike looked at them both, and a warm smile slowly spread across his face. For the first time in his life, the wealthy farmer truly felt rich. And in that peaceful home filled with laughter, good food, and the healing power of forgiveness, Asubike finally lived like a king.